Assalamualaikum. My name is Arfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I just want to quickly share with you what did Alexander of Alexandria believe about the father and the son. What did he believe about the relationship between the father and the son? This is around the year 300, whereby Alexander of Alexandria was writing to Alexander of Rome, the Bishop Alexander in Rome. And I have here by Professor Bart Ehrman, a reader, and I have, as you can see here, underlined, and I've studied Alexander of Alexandria for a while. Now, there's a lot of people who claim that he believed in the Trinity, and this is actually not true at all. None of the patristic scholars of modern age today accept this view, and this is something very clear cut, that even if you read his own letter, Alexander of Alexandria, it is absolutely clear that he doesn't believe in the Trinity. In fact, he made a distinction, between the Father and the Son, and that the Son is begotten, but the Father is unbegotten. And there, even though the Son existed with the Father since eternal past, that the Son and Father had always existed before the advent of time, for example, but only the Father is ungenerated, and the Son is generated because the Son is begotten, and only the expression unbegotten can be applied to the Father. So even though Alexander of Alexandria tries so hard not to make this distinction between the Father and the Son, well, in fact, his very own writings betray him. Whether he believed this or not, we do not know, because we do not have Alexander to interrogate in front of us here today. But based on what he wrote, whatever he wrote is not necessarily what he believes. And how do we know this? Because many times in his writings, he says that only the Father is unbegotten and the Son is begotten. So even though Alexander of Alexandria do not make a distinction between, or tries not to make a distinction between the Father and the Son, well, the very fact is that he did make a distinction between the Father and the Son, because only the Father is unbegotten, and the Son is begotten. So relatively, that is what betrays his writings, and a lot of people have misunderstood this, and sometimes they do not read in full, and they quote or interpret the ambiguous verses of his writings, which are not a lot. I don't know how people would misquote him, because his writing is pretty much clear cut, but they have missed out the point whereby only the Father can be considered as unbegotten. So now, how do we come about to understand this? Us living about 18 centuries after, Alexander of Alexandria was probably around the year 200. He died, and then Athanasius, one of his prominent students, carry on his legacy all the way until Constantinople 381. Well, he died before that, but Cappadocian Fathers later on. And so how do we come about to understand? We cannot really understand what Alexander really understood, but what we can is imply what he might have believed. Now, he uses words that the Son resembles the Father, and this somehow rings a bell because of Origen, who say that the Father and the Son, the relationship between the Father and the Son is like the sun and the rays, the rays of the sun, whereby if there's no sun, then there's no rays, if you get what I mean. But Alexander of Alexandria uses pretty much the same concept, but he doesn't use the sun and the rays. But the Son resembles the Father perfectly, even. okay, an exact resemblance of the Father. So what does this mean then? It's just like when you look at yourself in the mirror, okay, so that is the relationship between the Father and the Son. Now obviously Arius, he goes on. Arius is a very smart person. And he obviously rejected this view because again, we do not need to get into Arius' view. This is about Alexander of Alexandria. And so moving on, all things are created through the Son. And one of Alexander's argument was that if the Son is of lesser or the Son is different, okay, and if the Son is not the same as the Father in a sense, then how can all things be created through him? Okay, when he himself is created, he called Arius an idiot. If you read his letter clearly, and says that how can you say that the existence of a person came only after he had existed? Okay, so because it doesn't make sense, right? So you exist, and then people say that, oh, your existence comes after your existence. How do you fathom that? Okay, it doesn't make sense to Alexander of Alexandria. And so if all things are created through the Son, and the Son himself is created, then how can all things be created through the Son when the Son himself is created? It gets confusing here, but I hope you're following along. And so that is the view that perplexed Alexander of Alexandria, and that is what caused him to wrote vehemently against Arius. And also he mentions Paul of Samosata and things like that, because it doesn't make sense to him. But then he also quotes John 14:28 twice in his letter to Alexander in Rome. And then he says that the Father is greater than I. Okay, he quotes John 14:28, and this is what differentiates between Alexander and later on what to be known as the Trinitarian doctrine even, and that the Father is the only unbegotten. Okay, meaning the Father has a different status than the Son. Okay, because the Son is generated. Okay. And this is the argument that Arius proposed. I do not want to get into the discussion of Arius here, but it is necessary, because Arius proposed that how can you say that the Father and the Son is together if the one that is generated definitely is of a lower status than the one who generates the generated. You get what I mean? So in other words, how can you say that the Son and the Father is equal? Okay, because one of the argument is that a father only exists because there's a son. Okay, but if there's no son, then the Father is God. He cannot be a father, because the word father only makes sense. Okay, can only be given sense to it when there is a son. And so this is the relationship between the Father and the Son. Okay. But before the Father is called Father, he is God. Okay, this is the view Alexander himself proposes in his writings. But Arius came to say that, okay, if you say that the Father and the Son have existed since eternal past, because you say that the Father cannot exist without the Son, okay, but then you have two gods now. There is not one God. And so that is why Arius say that the Father and the Son is the relationship, but there was a time when the Son did not exist. Okay, and before the Son existed, the Father is God. When the Son exists, then the God became the Father. Okay, basically God and Father is a name. It's just a name used, okay, as an application, but it doesn't mean that there are two different persons. Okay, it's just like a husband. Okay, a husband has a wife, and then before the wife gave birth. Once the wife gave birth, then the husband became a father. Okay, but before the wife gave birth, the husband or the father is just a husband. Okay, so father and husband is the same person. Okay, it is not two separate entity. It is literally the same person. This is the view that Sabellius adopted as well in the mid third century, and it was declared heresy because that means that if the father is the son, and that means that when the son suffer, the father suffer as well, which is why in the West it is called patripassanism, meaning the doctrine of the father suffered, okay? And this is rejected as well. And so because they want to say that God cannot suffer, okay, but the resemblance of God could suffer and to die for the sins of humanity. This is later debate. We're jumping the gun here. But Arius proposed that how can you say that there are two eternal beings? Okay, meaning there are two gods now. They are not one God. So that's why Arius said that there was a time whereby the Son did not exist. Okay. Again, Arius believed that the Son doesn't have a soul and so on and so forth. Okay, but that is besides the point here. Now, Alexander of Alexandria, pretty much in a lot of his writings, we can say that he do not believe in the Trinity, because the Trinity says that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they are three beings. Okay, but they share the same ousios, they share the same essence. Okay, but Alexander clearly, and there's no distinction between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. A God from God, meaning all three have the same status. They are all gods, but there's no three gods. There's only one God, because they share the same ousia, they share the same essence, but they are three separate beings. Okay, that share the same essence. That is a Trinitarian view that is proposed by Constantinople 381. But Alexander clearly believed that only the Father is unbegotten, meaning only the Father is ungenerated, whereas the Son is generated. Even though he didn't use the word generated here, I mean, we're being anachronistic by using this word because he never mentioned it in his writing. He basically says that the Son is begotten, okay, of the Father, and that they have the same. Again, I do not want to use the word ousia here because he doesn't really use that language, and he doesn't imply the language to be used in the later sense of the language, the meaning of it later on, because during this period, persons or being, okay, or hon, the Greek word being, is used interchangeably with ousia, with essence. Okay, being and essence, basically, to put it in a nutshell, they have the same meaning. By this time, by when Alexander of Alexandria was writing, there were no distinction between being and ousia, essence. And so how do I put Alexander of Alexandria? What was his belief? Because we know that his writing betrays what he wanted to say. In a sense, that's what I believe. I mean, from what I read, it's very clear that he wanted to make a distinction. He doesn't want to make a distinction between the Father and the Son, the way Arius does. But somehow he has fallen into the same hole that Arius had fallen into, and that because he kept on saying that the Father is the only unbegotten. Okay, and he says that we should not waste our time trying to understand how can this be, or what is the substance of the Father, or how did the Father begot the Son, and things like. He warned us in his writings that we should not waste our time, because only the Son knows the Father. Okay, and obviously we no longer have the Son. Okay, here to question us, and so from what we can, from at least for me, from what I believe, having read his and studied his texts, and read what other scholars say about him, I propose that Alexander of Alexandria, he believed that the Son, even though they have the same being, okay, or they have this. Remember, the word being and ousios is pretty much the same, used interchangeably during this time. At least that's what Hansen say, and that. But if you were to put it in a nutshell, I believe that Alexander of Alexandria believed that the Father is greater than the Son, because he quotes this. Okay, John 14:28. He quotes this twice in his writings. Yeah, meaning that even though the Father and the Son existed since eternal past, okay, and this is different from the Arian view that there was a time whereby the Son did not exist. Okay, so even though Alexander of Alexandria believed that that the Father and the Son had always existed, and then the creation was created through the Son. Okay, meaning the Son needs to exist eternally. If not, how can a created being himself, okay, produce creation, or creations being created from a created being? Again, the language is very difficult to explain to you, but I hope you get what I mean. And so that's why Alexander of Alexandria, he refused to accept Arian belief, that Arius's belief that there was a time where the Son did not exist. But even though Alexander of Alexandria believed that the Son and Father had always existed, but the Father is the only unbegotten, and that the Son is begotten. How did this begotten thing happen? Alexander warned us not to waste our time, because I mean, how can a created mind trying to believe or try to comprehend the uncreated being, things like that. And so, in a nutshell, we see that Alexander of Alexandria make a distinction between the Father and the Son. And one proof text is 14:28 from John. And he also says that the Father is the only unbegotten, and that only the Father can be unbegotten, meaning the Father is not generated, okay, but the Son is begotten, meaning the Son is generated, even though he doesn't use this language, agenetos in Greek. But in a sense, we know that if we try to put Alexander of Alexandria in a certain camp, even though we cannot really do it this way, because he probably didn't believe in this, but he is somewhat a subordinationist. He is not an adoptionist, because adoptionist view is that Jesus became the Son at his baptism. He was adopted to become the Son of God at his baptism. Even though later on there's a view, again, this is where it gets very complicated and hard to follow along, whereby later on there was a view whereby the Holy Spirit, or the Word, the Logos, okay, entered into Jesus, okay, at his baptism. Okay, this is part of Docetism, meaning that there was the Son doesn't really suffer. It appears to be, And when Jesus was put on the cross, this logos left Jesus, okay, meaning left the human to suffer. Again, this was rejected later on because if Jesus is just like any other human being, then how can he die for the sins of the world? He needs to be divine so that he can die for the sins of the world. If he is divine, then how can there be only one God? So this is the debate that's again happening later on. But pretty much, in my view, Alexander of Alexandria is a subordinationist. He believed that the Son is subordinate to the Father, even though the Son and the Father existed since eternally past. Again, the proof text is 14:28 from John, and he insists that only the Father is unbegotten and the Son is begotten, even though the Son is a perfect resemblance of the Father. It's just like when you look at yourself in the mirror. Again, Arius counter this by saying that how can there be only one God if eternally there's the Father and the Son? But then again, Alexander of Alexandria countered this by saying that no. Even though there's a Father and a Son and they both existed since eternally past, but only the Father is ungenerated, but the Son is generated. So there is the distinction there. Even though Alexander of Alexandria tries not to make a distinction, or at least tries not to make a distinction, but in my view, his writings have betrayed him, just in a different way than what Arius proposed. So in a nutshell, we cannot really say that Alexander of Alexandria believed in the Trinity, even though he mentions that he believed there's only one Holy Spirit, okay, but he never goes into details about, okay, what is the being of this Holy Spirit. And so it is safe to say that Alexander of Alexandria can be grouped into a camp whereby definitely they'll be opposing to the Trinitarian views of 381 of the Cappadocian, or even of his student Athanasius much later on. But can we really say that even though he believed in the doctrine of the eternal generation of the Son, pretty much Origen believed that earlier. Origen obviously from Alexandria as well, but then he got into conflicts with his bishop, and so he moved to Caesarea, and that is when Eusebius of Caesarea learned from him, or at least have access to his writings. But we can pretty much put Origen to have somewhat an influence in both Arius and in the writings of Alexander of Alexandria. Athanasius, I would doubt so. Athanasius, his writing is much more wild. According to Hansen, Athanasius is confused, and he pretty much, and I would agree with Hansen, that Athanasius doesn't really know what he's writing. He's just quoting things out of context. He's being allegorical. And so, I mean, I follow those camp of opinions. There are many other opinions that are more sympathetic towards Athanasius, pretty much newer writings. But if you look at the writings in the 20th century, whereby they wrote about Athanasius, they're very much an apologist towards Athanasius. They are for Athanasius. They're pro-Athanasius. But then again, towards the 21st century, towards the end of the 21st century, and early in this century, scholarship has changed, and that the writings of Athanasius, or the writings of the people of the past, have been reanalyzed, re-examined, and Athanasius actually was the sole opponent, or was the sole proponent, okay, of the controversy. He light a flame into the rubbish bin, for example, and then it sparked into a huge controversy. Whereas pretty much during the time whereby, after the time of Arius, Again, the way Arius died was that he died in the toilet, according to the writings of his opponent. Sometimes when you read primary text, it's very funny because um, you'll not. It is funny to me because the amount of name calling that they have, they is just like a kid writing to another kid and scolding bad words to other kids. But you have to see that these were one of the greatest intellectuals of the past, and yet they wrote in a way whereby they call each other idiot, um, all sorts of name, and the way they wrote about their opponents, like Arius, he died in a bathroom. Even if you look at the book of Acts, even Herod Agrippa was eaten by worms, and that is how he died. And so it is funny to just read the polemics that I found in some of these early Christian writings. There's a lot of name callings here. It should be PG rated, this text. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.